Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the annual Quinn Memorial Lecture. My name is Jeff Hall. I'm the head of the Department of Psychology here. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to join me for a moment in acknowledging that UBC is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and we thank the Musqueam Nation for its hospitality and support of our work. 2016 is the 11th year of the Quinn Memorial Lecture. This lecture is made possible by a generous gift to our department from our prominent alumnus, Dr. Michael J. Quinn. In 1969, Dr. Quinn became just the second person to receive a PhD in psychology from UBC. After obtaining his doctorate, he went on to have a long and distinguished career as a clinical psychologist at Riverview Hospital in Coquitlam. Dr. Quinn's endowment has allowed the Department of Psychology to establish several important undergraduate and graduate student research and travel awards, in addition to this distinguished lecture series. And I'd now like to ask my colleague, Dr. Jiaying Zhao, to come up and introduce this year's eminent guest.
It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ellen Bialystok, today for the Quinn Memorial Lecture today. As I was telling Ellen that her visit was the single joy of my otherwise depressing week. So thank you, Ellen, for making me happy. I really appreciate it. So Ellen is the Distinguished Research Professor of Psychology and the Walter Gordon York Research Chair of Lifespan Cognitive Development at York University. Her research uses behavioral and neuroimaging methods to examine the effect of experience on cognitive processes across the lifespan, with most attention on the effect of bilingualism. So Ellen has won many distinguished awards, including the Hebb Award from the Canadian Society for Brain, Behavior, and Cognitive Science, the Killam Prize for the Social Sciences. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and this year, she was named an Officer of the Order of Canada for her contributions to our understanding of bilingualism and for opening up new avenues for research in her field. So I'm truly excited, I'm deeply grateful to have Ellen as our speaker today. So without further ado, please welcome Ellen Bialystok.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for elevating the invitation to this great honor of it being the Quinn Memorial Lecture. I'm really very humbled by that and grateful to everyone. And I understand it's the first time in memory that it's not raining in Vancouver, and so I'll take all the credit for that. All right, so I'm going to give you an overview of my research, and then I'm going to try to zero in on several points that I want to make. My most general framing of the work I do is neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity refers to this kind of persistent, systematic effect that experience can have on our minds and brains. I have two ways of thinking about it using silly metaphors. So experience affects our minds and brains. Consider first our brains. In what meaningful sense can our brains actually respond to experience? And I think about it in terms of a beach. So you have the substance, the sand, and it has a certain texture, and the imprint of whatever has just walked across it is left embedded in the structure. So that's kind of my metaphor for brains. Experience leaves footprints on the brain. For minds, it's more about the process. So here my metaphor, I've used this slide in very hot southern places, and everybody looks at me like I'm crazy, but you will all get this. My metaphor is cross-country skiing. So you go out into a big field of snow, and it's very hard to get to the other side, but over continual use of the same tracks, they get deeper and faster and more automatic. So that's my metaphor for neuroplasticity of mental processes. So it's the idea that an experience has this power to change both the structural aspects of the brain involved in that experience and the efficiency or automaticity of the processes. Now, I'll be arguing that bilingualism is one such experience. Why? Why would bilingualism have this awesome power to change minds and brains? First, there is nothing we do in our lives that is more intense, more sustained, or more whole brain based than use language. If you are, as I was saying just an hour ago, if you're a professional musician and you practice every day because this is your livelihood, you're still only playing your instrument 4 hours a day. But language is constantly part of your interactions with the world. So in terms of its intensity, in terms of the extent of the experience, it is, I think, unparalleled. Well, all right, so you use language a lot, but that's not in and of itself enough for it to lead to neuroplastic changes. How would it do it? The key to understanding the mechanism is in the finding that is fairly universally accepted, more so than any other finding I know in psychology, that if you're bilingual, both languages are simultaneously active. Even if you're in a context where one of your two languages is utterly unnecessary, you will never, in the course of this interaction, I'm not going to switch into Cantonese. If you know Cantonese, you have no reason to have it active. But if you know Cantonese, it is active. And it's this finding of joint activation that is the key to understanding why bilingualism has this power. Because with joint activation, where you have to only select from one of the languages, there's constant competition from the other language. And with constant competition, we need a mechanism. We need to avoid interference, we need to select appropriately, and we need to produce fluent linguistic behavior in the correct language. So the argument is that this joint activation has set up a rather ridiculous situation that the brain now has to solve. And it does so by recruiting some domain general attention mechanism constantly so that language processing goes ahead in the correct language. All right, that's how. So what? What are the consequences? Well, there's two basic consequences. But the main one I'm going to be talking about is that these domain general selective attention processes are strengthened. They are the thing that those mind and brain modifications affect. And so we can see evidence of brain changes in regions responsible for selective attention and more automatic and efficient behavior in performing tasks that require selective attention. That's the whole story. Now there is I just want to pause here and take this idea that I threw out about joint activation and the need for selection. Now, if you're going to build a brain that could handle two languages, you probably wouldn't do it this way. What you would probably do is create a switch, right? So there's two languages represented, and you only can use one of them at a time, and one of them is appropriate and one of them isn't. So the obvious way to build the brain is to have a toggle switch where you have that language active and that language active and so on. So you only have to deal with the relevant language, but we know that's not true because of the really enormous amount of evidence for joint activation. So what actually we have is a situation where two languages are active and the mechanism is required to shine the light appropriately. It's a completely different kind of cognitive process than the kind that would be necessary in a switch situation. And much of the research looking at the cognitive consequences has falsely assumed the switch model and then run into trouble with the outcomes of that research when the evidence really leads to the joint activation spotlight model. They're different processes, so you expect different consequences. All right, now I'm going to return briefly to the point about the consequences. There are some linguistic consequences of bilingualism, and almost counterintuitively, I think, the main one is that language processing is more effortful, for the reasons I've just described. So you also have reduced representation of each language on average. Now, I'm only going to show you one slide on this just to make the point, and I'm not going to come back to this point later. But I do want to show the sort of other side of bilingualism. In contrast, we have the enhancements of attention processing that I mentioned. Okay, so let's look at these linguistic consequences. And the main ones have to do with vocabulary. It is the case that bilinguals, on average, have smaller vocabulary in each language than a monolingual speaker of that language. Now, they have a whole other language, so they are not vocabulary impoverished by any means. But in each language, on average, they have fewer words in their repertoire than a monolingual speaker of each language. This shows up not only on vocabulary tests, but on things like verbal fluency tasks. Generate all the names of animals you can think of in 60 seconds, or all the names of fruits you can think of in 60 seconds, and so on. Bilinguals typically perform more poorly on those tests. Now, that's important because many of these tests, verbal fluency being a prime example, are used as neuropsych measures of brain functioning. So you fall off your bike, you go to the hospital, bang your head, you might be given a verbal fluency test. And if you're bilingual, you're going to produce fewer words. And if the clinical clinician, if the clinical neuropsychologist who's administering the test doesn't know you're bilingual, may misinterpret your score. This is a large clinical problem. Slower to retrieve words, picture naming is slower, and smaller vocabulary. I just want to show you a picture of this smaller vocabulary. These are results from a receptive vocabulary test that we gave to about 1,700 kids or about 1,600 adults, but the scores are standardized for age, so they're all on the same scale. On this test, the mean is 100. It's a PPVT test. The mean is 100. You get nice normal distributions, but what you see is that the red lines, which are always monolinguals in my slides, the red lines have a higher mean score, although perfectly normal distribution, than the bilinguals. So on average, bilinguals have smaller vocabulary in each language. You can combine those two graphs. There's this little bit of a wonky point from the adult data, I don't know why. But you see, those aren't really bad normal distributions, about 33,000 and some odd individuals. This has been drawn backwards. Never mind. Okay. I never noticed that before. Okay. All right, but what I'm going to talk about for the whole rest of the time is the cognitive effects, the way that the experience of using two languages might impact nonverbal cognition. So it's a leap, right? We're not surprised that there's linguistic effects. We might be surprised about the direction. But the real surprise is that there are nonverbal cognitive effects, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So this is a slide that contains the entire body of literature for cognitive effects of bilingualism. It's all there. I mean, it's a large literature. You can go out and read 1,000 papers, or you can look at this one slide. So we have the lifespan across the top. Above the dotted line, I've put behavioral studies. Below the dotted line are brain studies. I've listed them in terms of the kind of study and the main findings. So there are a lot of one-off studies that I have not included. I've only included things that have, for each entry, a substantial number of studies behind them. And then in each case, I've indicated either a little green check mark showing that monolinguals and bilinguals perform differently, and indeed bilinguals perform better, or a red X, which does not mean bilinguals are worse. It means that the plurality of studies of that type show no group differences. So there are some red X's, there's a lot of green check marks, and there's a lot of different kinds of studies. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is zoom in on 3 snapshots from this slide and talk about what the data are and try to understand the outcomes in terms of what I was just telling you about the effects on selective attention. So we're going to start with research with children. A lot of boring stuff here. Instead of thinking about bilingualism as a categorical variable, I want to suggest that it's a more meaningful way to think about it as a continuous variable. In most populations, and certainly in educated populations, and most certainly in places like Vancouver, it's pretty hard to find someone who is so monolingual they have absolutely no experience with or contact with or proficiency in something. It's almost a fantasy category. So what we've been doing more recently in our research is assigning people a bilingualism score on a continuous scale that indicates relative degree of bilingualism, and that allows us to take this as a scale concept instead of a categorical concept. Any trait that can be measured in people should fall on a normal distribution, and we're going to assume that our measures of degree of bilingualism do this. Now, executive function ability, which is really the sort of set of tasks that we're talking about, we've shown in our research are performed better by children who are bilingual. But we know something else about executive function tasks, and that is they're very difficult for children who have poor attentional ability. And I'm not talking about attentional ability that's so poor that it becomes clinically diagnosed as an attentional disorder. I mean in the normal distribution of attentional ability that everyone has. So just as we can scale degree of bilingualism in a population, we can also scale degree of attention. So we know that children with clinical attention difficulties do poorly on executive function tasks. So the question is, what happens when these two forces converge in the same kids? Is there an interaction between the uplifting effects of bilingualism and the difficulties imposed by poor attention? And we decided to study this by taking a large typical population of kids for whom we can scale their ability in attention and their level of bilingualism to see if they're interacting. We had just over 200 children, and they were 8 to 11 years old, and they're all typically developing. We were very careful about this, so no clinically diagnosed children were in the sample. Those are some background measures, pretty boring. And we gave them 3 tests, three executive function tasks. We chose these tasks because they all make somewhat different attentional demands. And they've all been used in some way in the literature, either with bilingual children or with children with attentional disorders. So we had a basis for predicting how children would perform on these tasks. So we start with a flanker task. It's a conflict resolution task. We didn't use, these kids are 8 to 11 years old, so we didn't use the children's version with fish. We just gave them arrows and arrowheads. And very simply, they had to indicate with the key press which way the central arrow was pointing under the usual sorts of conditions and manipulations. Now, the way we analyzed the data was to use regression analyses where we first put in all the background measures, age, intelligence, vocabulary, all that stuff, and then we put in degree of bilingualism and degree of attentional control to see if anything was left over after accounting for the usual stuff that would significantly explain performance on the task. So for the flanker, the little asterisks mean there's significant contribution, and in this case there's a significant contribution from bilingualism, from attention, and from their interaction. Okay? It all mattered to their performance. The second task is a non-verbal spatial working memory task that we'd used a number of times. You see this matrix, it's a 3x3 matrix, and then little frogs pop up, and you have to remember the sequence either in front order or in reverse order, and sometimes in even more complex order. So it's very straightforward spatial working memory. We have shown that bilingual children perform this task better than monolingual children. Now, we didn't really have a prediction for attention. It's a working memory task, and attention is important for working memory, but crucially, it's not a timed task. So they're under no pressure. And I think for attention, this kind of time limit is an important factor. So we find here there's an effect of bilingualism, the more bilingual, and it's not a group effect. It's not bilingual children versus monolingual children. The effect is the more bilingual children were, the higher their scores. And there was no effect of attention. And finally, we gave them a stop signal task, which is really, this is the gold standard for attention and attention disorders. You have to press a key every time there's a stimulus, but on oddball trials, you get a signal to refrain from responding. So you need a lot of control, a lot of attention and control. And here we found an effect of bilingualism and an effect of attention. So these showed us that, importantly, bilingualism and attentional ability are both significantly contributing to children's performance on these tasks. That's a very important finding because often when you only look at one of these two factors, if we would only look at bilingualism, say, then a criticism that we get is that something else was confounded with it. Maybe, I know people have lots of rapid explanations for all the 100 things that we forgot to measure that were certainly confounded and accounting for the results. But if you can systematically manipulate more than one variable and still show an effect on your main independent variable, that's more certain. So in all of these three tasks, we found there was an effect of bilingualism on everyone. Sometimes there was an effect of attention as well. And they both have this continuous influence. These aren't categorical comparisons, but in both cases, the more bilingual or the more attentionally adept they were, the better their performance. And crucially, even though we had that interaction effect, I'm not showing you the graph of the interaction effect, but it isn't all that interesting. The crucial thing is that greater bilingualism is always beneficial. It's beneficial for children with very poor attention, and it's beneficial for children who have really wonderful attentional control. It always helps. And the interaction kind of just niggles around at the corners of that to show where it might help a little more, a little less. The relation between effects of bilingualism and effects of attention depend on the task. I'm not going to go through it in that level of detail, but it depends what the main process required for the task was. And we know that there's a limit on this because in 2 published studies using adults with clinical diagnosis of ADHD, bilinguals performed worse than monolinguals. So if it's a typical population and these children vary in their degree of attention, but they are not clinically impaired, bilingualism will always help. But there comes a point where it seems to be, on the basis of 2 studies, that it might stop helping and begin to interfere. And it actually makes sense, because if bilingualism is somehow boosting this attention system, if the attention system is actually impaired as opposed to just sort of poor, bilingualism isn't going to have anything to help with. Okay, that's the first snapshot. That was children. Good. Let's move on and look at adults. I'm going to look at behavioral studies of adults and older adults. This group of studies takes the kinds of tasks that I just showed you for these children and looks only at things like reaction time and accuracy as adults and older adults who are monolingual or bilingual do these tasks that contain conflict or distraction or interference. Here's a study we published a long time ago that nobody seems to remember. We gave people of all ages a simple task. It's a Simon task. The rule is if you see a red square, press the button on the left. If you see a green square, press the button on the right. You have red and green squares that create congruent and incongruent trials. Very simple task, okay? Incongruent trials take longer, they have more interference. It's a very standard executive function task. So we gave this task, and this study was published in 2005, to children. Same task. Now remember I said monolinguals are always in red, except when I draw the graph backwards, as I happen to do already. So these are reaction times, so monolingual children take longer on both congruent and incongruent trials than bilingual children. Moving along the lifespan, we turn to young adults. Monolingual and bilingual young adults take exactly the same amount of time. There isn't a smidge of difference between them. We move then into middle age. These are sort of 40 to 50-year-olds, 40, 45-year-olds, and the lines are coming apart again. And particularly what's coming apart is that the monolinguals are slowing down. So the bilingual 40-year-olds aren't too much different from the bilingual 20-year-olds, but the monolinguals are. And then into older age, and they're even further apart. So we have here this anomaly where for young adults, there is no difference. There's a lot of reasons I think might explain this, and one is that there's a ceiling effect. If you look at this literature, the overall reaction time for young adults performing any of these tasks is about 500 milliseconds. That's about what we have here. It's pretty tough to get an entire group to, on average, go faster than 500 milliseconds just because they happen to speak French. It would be quite amazing. But for children and older adults, you have slower reaction times, you have more variability, you have more to work with, more room for experience to make a difference. This point I don't want to dwell on, but it has to do with the, I believe now discredited explanation that what bilinguals are doing is inhibiting better. I don't think they are at all, but I'll just move on. Now there are, as you may know, many recent studies arguing that there are no effects of bilingualism on executive function. But the vast majority of those studies look at young adults performing these tasks. So we knew there was no effect. All right, so that's the basic data. If we set up a study properly, we can show that behaviorally there are differences between monolinguals and bilinguals in performing an executive function task. We want to figure out, though, what those differences are. Why do we see them in some tasks and not others? Why do so many studies, especially with young adults, show no differences at all? It depends what you mean by executive function. How do you operationalize what these affected processes are, and how do you measure them? So I'm going to briefly just look at two different ways of conceptualizing this. The most prevalent model in the field is the Miyake Model, where executive function is considered in terms of three distinct but correlated subcomponents, referring more or less to, I don't see what order I have in them, updating, shifting, and inhibition. Updating is essentially working memory. So call it working memory, shifting, and inhibition. That's his concept. And a lot of the literature, a lot of the research on this question takes that as the assumption and then investigates quite systematically performance on these three components. Now that would make a lot of sense if that switch model were true. If the bilingual brain were based on a switch, that's precisely what you would find, because to switch the toggle, you need to sort of inhibit, you need to shift. All that kind of language fits quite well with the switching model of bilingualism. But these components don't really hold up to scrutiny when we investigate monolingual and bilingual populations. And I think more seriously, the concepts don't fit with what we know about joint activation and the absence, the complete absence of a language switch. So instead, you can think about a more continuous model. And this is a model from Randy Engel, but I just use it as a kind of a placeholder to show how you can conceptualize what he calls executive attention, a term I like very much, as a continuum that gradually changes in the amount of effortfulness, the amount of attention required in a continuous way, but is always on in some sense. And that's why I think it's already a better fit with this spotlight model. So in his view, memory and attention are the basis of complex cognition, rather than these subcomponents as distinct entities. It's a continuum of complexity. So that's the kind of the underlying model, the framework in which I think bilingualism is having its effects. It's a continuous adaptation. I'll come back to that on the last slide. It's a continuous adaptation of memory and attention. Now, if we're going to take this as a more continuous, more integrative way of viewing executive function, then you need to do different kinds of experiments. So I'm just going to show you two simple examples that aren't quite there. I mean, they don't have this continuous component that I think we need to move towards, but I think they're better than the research that's looking at these very static subcomponents. This is inhibition, this is shifting, and so on. So integrating what I'm going to call interference and facilitation. I'm going to give you two examples. And the Stroop effect seems to work out rather nicely. The Stroop effect is wonderful because for many people, it's just such a clear example of an executive function test. You know, it doesn't matter if you want to say, well, you're inhibiting reading the word or you're not. Nobody really knows if you're actually inhibiting reading the word. It's very integrative. You have the word, the color, and you have to say what the color is. So there's a lot of stuff going on. You have to attend to the color. You have to not attend to the word. It's not this kind of binary or subcomponent. It's not congenial with this subcomponent analysis. So Stroop effect we've used a few times. Here's data from two studies. Each study looked at younger and older monolinguals and bilinguals. We had 96 in each of the two studies. We obviously had all the necessary control condition. And I'm going to show you the data from the two studies at the same time because they're the same. So these are, they're plotting different things. This is how much more effort is needed for the incongruent trials. This one is how much more time is needed for the incongruent trials. But you have monolingual and bilingual young adults, and monolingual and bilingual older adults. And you have, again, two main effects. So older adults find it harder and they take longer. And monolinguals find it harder and take longer. So in both studies, there's two main effects and no interaction. But we can recast those data. Instead of showing performance by condition, but we can take scores that represent what I'm calling facilitation and interference. Because if this is an ongoing process, there should be a constant effect. You don't only suddenly respond when there's an incongruent trial. If both languages are always active, you're constantly getting facilitation if there's some kind of priming or cognate, and interference if there's something that's misleading. So we can replot all the data to show effects of facilitation. This is control baseline minus congruent trials, or interference, which is control baseline minus incongruent trials. This is an old slide. I wouldn't use the word inhibition now, I'd say interference. And what you can see is that there's not a lot going on in facilitation, but the older bilinguals are showing more facilitation than the older monolinguals. And in interference, it's very clear. These are down because they're interference. So the older adults have more interference than the younger adults, but crucially, the monolinguals have more interference than the bilinguals. So it's just reorganizing the data to look at in a more ongoing way. The next example is a more complex study. It's a sort of a Sternberg paradigm. You see 4 figures, then you have a blank, and then you see a probe, and you just have to say whether the probe was in the set, and it was, so you say yes, and then you see another stimulus and another probe, and you say yes. And that's easy because that second probe was in the previous and the n-1 slide as well, so it's been primed. There's facilitation. And the other main condition is you get back to that point, and then the final probe was not in the previous set, but it was in the n-1 set, so now you get interference. interference, okay? So you can take the data and plot them the same way, getting interference and facilitation scores. Note that this task is completely different from the Stroop task. Everything about it is different. It's this sort of ongoing working memory task. It's not a Stroop task in any sense. But we can get facilitation and interference data from it, and they look remarkably similar to what we saw in the Stroop task. Again, we're getting bilingual facilitation, and we're getting less interference for bilinguals on this completely different task. And just to compare, those were the Stroop data I showed you 2 slides back. So very similar results. So we can reconceptualize the data, not in terms of how long did it take to respond to this trial or that trial, but in terms of something that's sort of more integrative, more ongoing, and more similar across these very different executive function tasks. All right, that's the second snapshot. And for the third snapshot, we're going to look at older age and dementia, the onset of dementia. Well, there's now a growing body of research that's looking at this. And I'll come back to some of the original studies in a minute, but I want to start with a more recent study, because in this study we were of course interested in the question of whether or not bilinguals were protected from the onset of dementia. But what we wanted to do in this study that no other study that I'm aware of has done is put it in the context of their cognitive abilities. So in the studies that I'll show you a couple of slides from now, where we just look at age of onset, we don't really know what their cognitive function was, neither at the time they were diagnosed nor when we actually included them in the study. So that was something we needed to correct in this study. We wanted to also find out what happens over time. So if bilinguals are showing symptoms of dementia later than monolinguals, is it because they've managed to put a finger in the dam, but then the water will gush through, break the wall, and they fall off a cliff? So what they're really buying themselves is a little bit of time? Or is there a sustained protection? And very little evidence on that. So these are the sorts of things we were interested in. We wanted to confirm that the bilinguals and monolinguals actually were cognitively similar, because almost no studies have been able to do that. So we went into their homes, we visited patients in their homes, and we gave them a battery, a standardized neuropsych battery of executive function tasks. And we visited them every 6 months until they could no longer perform the tasks. We also wanted to get a broader picture, so we included patients with mild cognitive impairment. Amnestic mild cognitive impairment is sometimes called early Alzheimer's. There's a formulaic conversion rate at which patients with amnestic mild cognitive impairment inevitably convert to Alzheimer's disease, so this is a known trajectory. So we wanted to get a broader picture and include them as well. In MCI, most cognitive measures appear to be normal, but there's a specific abnormality, usually memory, which is the amnestic part. So something isn't right, but on broadly based cognitive functions, they test normal, but something is off. So we used these much more detailed assessments. We also gave them questionnaires to investigate their lifestyle things, or how active they are, how much they exercise, what kind of diets they have, kinds of foods they eat, and so on. So we tried to really fill out the profile because this was crucial but missing information from the literature. And here's who we got. We had, so these numbers are kind of on the small side for this sort of research, but that's because we visited them repeatedly in their homes. Every patient, was seen on multiple occasions. So MCI, monolinguals and bilinguals, Alzheimer's disease, monolinguals and bilinguals. These are the years of education, and these are just general cognitive scores. Monolinguals and bilinguals did not significantly differ, even though those numbers might look different, within diagnostic groups. What does differ is the age of onset. For MCI, the bilinguals were about 5 years older than the monolinguals. And for Alzheimer's disease, the bilinguals were about 6 years older than the monolinguals. So this lines up with our previous studies. So that's the sample. But what was novel about this study was how they did on these executive function tasks. Now, given that the bilinguals are older, is it because they are actually more impaired? Did they wait longer? Did they decline more before they actually showed up at the neurologists and received their diagnosis? So here's the performance on several of the executive function tasks. This is the verbal fluency. So again, MCI is solid, and they're always higher than the AD patients. There's no difference. This is trail making. No difference. No difference. Interesting. The only case, and we had so many contrasts and so many subtests, the only case of a language group difference was in the Stroop Effect, where the bilingual Alzheimer's patients performed better than the other three groups. So 2 slides ago, I showed you better performance on a Stroop test by bilinguals. That's holding up even into dementia. But on everything else, they're the same. So even though the bilinguals are older, they're not more impaired. They're performing at an equivalent level. All right, what happens next? We visited them as often as we could and re-administered these tasks. So these bars show change in performance over time. The bars point down because they almost always get worse. The crucial question is, do they get worse at different rates if they're monolingual or bilingual? Statistically, the answer is no. So I know you can see that these bars are all over the place, but there is no statistical difference. Impressionistically, if you just sort of squint and look at these graphs, the red bars seem to dip a bit more, but it's not a statistically reliable difference. So what can we say about cognitive performance with dementia? We can say, I think, with some assurance now, that in spite of different ages of onsets, at the point of onset, the monolinguals and bilinguals are cognitively similar. So how is it that they're older? How come the bilinguals are older? And our explanation, our current working idea is that the bilinguals are compensating. So Alzheimer's disease begins by affecting the medial temporal lobe, particularly the hippocampus, which is where memory happens. And that's why the first and most salient symptom of Alzheimer's disease is memory failure. Because all of the Alzheimer's pathology, the beta amyloid plaques and tau tangles, congregate initially in the medial temporal lobe. We have no reason to believe that bilingual brains in and of themselves are more resistant to these pathologies. Now, some brains are more resistant, but that's a biological protection. In terms of protection by virtue of experience, it's not a logical hypothesis. So what we believe is that the bilinguals, as these brain regions deteriorate, compensate through more intact brain regions. Which regions would be more intact? We've seen now in several ways that bilinguals perform executive function tasks better than monolinguals. And the main regions for executive function performance are frontal. So the idea is, and we're studying this now, that bilinguals are using their more intact frontal region to compensate for deteriorating medial temporal regions. And this would allow them to conceal the progressing disease because their behavior is sustained at a higher level through compensation, through kind of a rewiring, doing things in a different way. I'm going to return now to the point that I've referred to several times about the age of diagnosis. There's now quite a lot of studies that are retrospective studies that simply look at the age at which dementia was diagnosed, okay? So it's retrospective because, you know, they come in when they come in. And here's a kind of a range of them. It's not all of the studies, but I want to point out a few things. Most of these this is the age of diagnosis. These are various studies. This is a study in India. This is a study in Belgium, study in Montreal. So in all of these studies, the bilinguals are older on average when they're diagnosed with dementia. Now, none of these studies include all those detailed cognitive tests I just showed you for ours, but that was to assure you that they really are at the same level, except there. So what's going on there? That's a study where we compared monolingual and bilingual patients with non-amnestic mild cognitive impairment, but with multiple domain mild cognitive impairment. So you remember I said mild cognitive impairment means mostly you're okay, but one thing is wrong, and it's usually memory. That's amnestic. Multiple domain means two things are wrong, memory, and the second thing that's wrong is almost always executive function. So these patients have an executive function impairment, and they get no advantage from being bilingual. And I would argue that the reason they get no advantage from being bilingual is because when the pathology starts destroying the medial temporal lobes, they have no resources for compensation because they have an executive function frontal disorder as well. No compensation, no protection. That, I think, is similar to the finding I mentioned earlier, where adults with clinical ADHD, clinical attention disorders, also perform worse than monolinguals on executive function tasks. So this whole enterprise is predicated on and absolutely depends on having intact frontal lobes and executive functioning capacity, because all of these bilingual effects are about exploiting that to boost performance broadly and compensate when dementia begins to compromise memory. Now, I used to like this. I'm not sure today I should be showing you this. You'll see why. This was an article in the New York Times just over a year ago. Somebody wrote an op-ed piece. The point of the op-ed piece was to implore NIH to double the funding for research in Alzheimer's disease, and the rationale is delaying the average onset of the disease by just 5 years would reduce the number of Americans with Alzheimer's disease in 2050 by 42% and cut costs by a third. Now, 5 years, we've got it. See, we've got the 5 years. But here's why I'm not comfortable about showing you this today. I mean, you know, I just, okay. But he said it, all right. Yeah. All right, so, yeah, okay. There's another way of looking at the dementia data. The sort of glaring flaw in the retrospective studies that I've shown you, including the one I started with, where we so carefully visited them in their homes. We were pretty scrupulous about it. The glaring flaw is that when you figure out, when you decide when the disease was, you know, when the onset of the disease was, or when the diagnosis was made, it's all a guess. You know, when did Dad really start looking a bit strange? Oh, it was about 3 years ago. It's about as accurate. So people have argued, you know, those data are all worthless because they're all based on these kinds of inferences backwards in time. So the only actual reliable data comes from prospective studies. And prospective studies take a cohort of healthy people and follow them over time and track the incidence of dementia in this group. So you start off with 100 healthy people and you sit back, you test them every year, and you just wait for them to fall. And then you can plot the rate of disease onset. Now, if you're going to compare two groups, then you know exactly when things started derailing. And so the argument is that prospective studies are much more reliable. Okay, let's see what happens. Now, most incidence studies, these prospective incidence studies, report there are no language group differences, that monolinguals and bilinguals succumb to dementia at the same rate, although there are a few that do report significant effects. But let's look at them. Here's a study that does report a significant effect. So the way you read this is a study that followed healthy older adults for a very short period for this kind of study, only 6 years. And these are hazard curves. So this is the proportion of the sample that becomes, gets diagnosed with dementia over time. What this study has done, this is Wilson and colleagues, is separate the groups by how bilingual they were. Their experience with a foreign language is their proxy for it. The solid line on the bottom have very little experience. They've taken some language courses in school, and progressively more experience. So it's perfectly stratified to correspond. I've actually, it's the other way around, right. Yeah, this is no foreign language experience. These are hazard rates. You can plot these curves either way, and you'll see the next one I show you is opposite, so it's very tricky. So lines up means more incidence in that sample, and the dotted line is no foreign language experience, and this is increasing amounts. The stratification is significant. So in this study, the more experience with a foreign language, the more protection there was against dementia. So there's a prospective incidence study that supports the hypothesis, but most don't. However, I think it's an artifact. The ones that don't, that is, I think are artifactual. Here's the most widely cited incidence study that concludes there is no protection against dementia as a function of bilingualism. This is a study by Zahodny and colleagues in New York, and it's an incidence study over a very long period of time. These data are from a 20-year period, and as I said, this one is backwards, so instead of showing rate of getting the disease, this is showing rate of staying healthy. Okay, so it's just reversed. And again, they stratified by how bilingual. So they asked a language-related question, but essentially the very well. How well do you speak English? Right? So the top line is the most bilingual, and they've stratified 4 groups according to how bilingual they are, and the stratification lines up absolutely perfectly with their incidence of dementia. Now, their overall model did not show a significant effect because of peculiarities about their analysis. They didn't control for age and other things. But I think that in looking at the graph, it's very clear that there was protection in a prospective study for being more bilingual. So the last way to, what I want to say there is that even when the data aren't statistically significant, I think the patterns are really clearly consistent. So the last point is to think about this in a completely different way. We've been talking about individuals who know languages and to different degrees, because some of them are not monolingual versus bilingual but scaled. But we can recast that in terms of societies. There are communities that are more bilingual, societies in which it's more normal, more expected for people to be bilingual. And so a recent study by Klein and colleagues said, let's take countries, and they selected 93 countries from all kinds of different regions in the world, with all kinds of economic circumstances, and using a linguistic algorithm, could label each country in terms of the society being essentially speaking only one language, or 2 languages, or 3, 4, or 5. And then look at incidence of Alzheimer's within each society. Now, what the data show, what you expect is that if this effect of just societal bilingualism is actually protective, societies that are more bilingual should have a lower incidence of Alzheimer's. But the first thing to notice is that of the 93 countries, 90% of the data, 90% of the countries are represented by only 2 points, essentially monolingual or essentially bilingual. So all of these funny dots all over the place outside the bars, that's just noise. There aren't enough data points. So only look in the boxes. The graph on the left shows the incidence of Alzheimer's across the countries as a function of monolingual versus bilingual. And the graph on the right has been adjusted for lifespan. And that's very important because Alzheimer's is a disease of aging. So you have to live long enough to actually get Alzheimer's disease. And what they have is a very strong effect both in the corrected and the uncorrected data, showing lower incidence of dementia in societies that are inherently more bilingual. So I think the incidence data actually fall into place very nicely in line with the retrospective studies. And the final point, I'm not going to talk about this study, but this is a study we published a few years ago showing that if you match monolinguals and bilinguals with Alzheimer's disease and age, these patients look exactly the same on every conceivable behavioral level. The bilinguals, and I'm not going to take time to explain this, I'll just show you the graph. The bilinguals have more disease in their brains. So this supports the compensation argument. In a brain scan, the monolinguals and bilinguals perform equivalently, have identical levels of Alzheimer's behavioral indices, but the bilinguals have more disease pathology. They're compensating. They're performing higher than would be expected by their brains. All right. And this is the last point I want to make. I want to try to explain how I think this works. What we've seen, and I haven't talked about all these studies, but from the snapshots I've picked, that across the lifespan, bilingualism is associated with better performance on a range of nonverbal cognitive tasks. These tasks tend to be those that involve conflict, that require the involvement of selective attention, frontal networks that control attention. And we've seen it across the lifespan, up to and including the use of these frontal attention networks to compensate for disease in older age. So something is being shaped, something is changing in the mind and brain, and I haven't talked about brain studies at all, but we can see analogs in that literature where these networks that are involved in these attention and executive processes are better in bilinguals. But how do we explain this? And I want to make a distinction between two possible ways of thinking about it. The most common one that people use to talk about this is transfer. What does transfer actually mean? It means that you learn something, some kind of process is built up in a skill that you can then apply to another skill. So this was the old story. When I used to think about this in terms of better inhibition, better inhibitory control in bilinguals, I'd say, yeah, it's because they have experience and practice in inhibiting that language that they're not using, so they just become better at inhibiting. But remember, inhibition really fit the wrong brain model. I don't think it's transfer at all. There is a literature on transfer of cognitive skills. Transfer of working memory, for example, is a big research enterprise now, and the effects are tiny. There's very little evidence that you learn something in one domain and simply plug it into another. So I prefer to think about this in terms of what I'm calling adaptation. For adaptation, you have two skills that happen, for whatever reason, to both rely to some extent on a common underlying process. Now that's not surprising because we have a limited number of processes. They get recycled in everything we do. But two skills that jointly you go into this same network, this same brain network, to achieve something. So that process is used for both. And what happens then, if we consider that one of those skills is language selection, And the other skill is these executive function tasks that for whatever reason are drawing on a common underlying process. And if that process is selective attention is simply going to be better all around because it's being brought in, recruited by these two separate things. It's perhaps a subtle difference, but nothing is actually transferred, in the way that the working memory people are looking at transfer across working memory tasks. And if this kind of story is right, that the selective attention system is adapted to a bilingual brain, it adapts to the demands on the brain by bilingualism, that is exactly what we mean by neuroplasticity. It's the hallmark of neuroplasticity. It adapts, it adjusts. So, in conclusion, we've seen these changes across the lifespan, and we've seen them in the brain, although I haven't really shown you any brain data, but there's the picture again, and we've seen them in the mind. I think that attention in some form is what's key to understanding these adaptations. Bilingualism changes the way we allocate attention. And I think this is now really what the infant research that Janet and her colleagues are doing are increasingly showing. Babies raised in bilingual environments from the beginning use attention differently, more selectively, more purposefully. Attention is changed. So I think this is powerful evidence for how an experience can have neuroplastic effects and make the brain better. Thank you very much.